Hi, I'm Bob Martin. For my sins, I got caught, and I'm organizing these things on a weekly or monthly basis now. Dr. Vucetic is a professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs and International Theory Network Coordinator at the Center for International Policy Studies, both at the University of Ottawa. He's the author of several books, including The Anglosphere, A Genealogy of Radicalized Identity and International Relations, Greatness and Decline, National Identity and British Foreign Policy, and co-author of The World of the Right, Radical Conservatism and the Global Order.
Thank you so much, Bob. I really appreciate it. And thanks to Michael for extending the invitation, to Bob for helping me with my PowerPoint, which is something I cobbled together this morning, basically, that really leads me into an apology, because normally when I come to Queens, which is where I love to come for reasons that are many, I present a chapter or an article or even a book. This time it's just a paper in the very, very first draft. So some of the stuff in the paper is very technical. You might have a lot of questions. I'm more than happy to share said paper with you. Just send me an email. There'll be an email at the very end, and then we'll take it from there. So it's a project that deals with topics that I think everyone not this one, at Queens will be familiar with. So the idea of ranking, the idea of middle powers or middle powerhood, Canada, of course, and this mega super region, the Indo-Pacific. So lots of people here in the Queens IR community and nearby academic communities have written on these topics. So I'll break down these four concepts or constructs, three of them rather, into short bits, and then I'll present the main argument. And that is, how do we rank Canada as a middle power in the Indo-Pacific? So this idea of ranking is an old one, right? Rankings are social, relational, intersubjective, and they are inherent to any kind of human subjectivity at the individual or kind of social level of any kind. What you see here is an image from one of the fathers of something called power transition theory, Ken Organsky from 1958, who was a materialist, objectivist, a realpolitik kind of infused IR style theorist. And he presented world politics as a hierarchy in which you have a top dog and those on the bottom, and a bunch of countries somewhere in the middle. So this is from 1958. Rankings are done essentially by any kind of by IR theorists of all hues. So my starting question was, okay, so where might Canada rank in the world today? And then that led me to a more historical question. Who was the first leader of Canada to rank Canada vis-a-vis other countries in world politics, right? And the working hypothesis is this. I don't know if you recognize this man. So I'll just tell you that he is one of the fathers of Confederation. So this being Kingston, you know all about Fathers of Confederation. This is the city that makes Canadian historians very proud. So do you have any idea who this might be?
Cartier.
Thank you. Georges-Étienne Cartier, the real father of Confederation. And this comes from Sir John E.A. When he was being interviewed by Sir John Pope, probably on the Rideau Street here, here in Kingston, right? So absent Cartier's interest in Confederation, this would have never happened. Canada, I mean. So he was the first to say, Canada will rank among the nations. So I found a book which I thought would be thicker that discusses this quote from May 1867. After coming back from the London conference, he met with a bunch of people, his supporters, but also regular citizens in Montreal, to give a speech about what happened in London. What we just agreed upon? What kind of polity is entering into force on July 1st, 1867? The Dominion of Canada. And I thought there'd be an explanation. So what exactly did he mean? What's the context of this historic ranking? I had to go into Montreal newspapers of the time to see what exactly he said. So there's different newspapers reported the speech differently, partly because he was speaking both languages. And he compared Canada to Britain and the United States. and this is what he said, rather than being a mere provincial state mere provincial colony, we will rank among the great maritime nations, such as Britain and the United States. So Canada in 1867 was 4 provinces, not even 4 million people, not connected at all in terms of communication, transportation. So it was aggrandizing moment, right? Politicians, like regular people, would engage in these kinds of statements all the time. But really bold, considering that Britain and the United States were empires of 30+ million people at that time. So it was in many ways an interesting statement to make. So he's the first. This makes me think about earlier rankings where Canada, even before it became itself, so before 1867, as a bunch of colonies. At what point did we decide it would be a good idea to call this country a dominion as opposed to a colony? That too was some kind of a ranking strategy, right? There's some really interesting work being done currently by folks like John DeBaugh that talks about the dominion status as a middle power category. We won't go into this prehistory. We won't go into Congress of Vienna or Italian city-states. But I will go, to the 1940s, which is exactly where everyone goes who studies Canadian middle powerhood, thanks to Adam Chapnick's wonderful book, The Middle Power Project. And essentially, it was Canadian diplomats who thought it would be a good idea to differentiate Canada from the rest, meaning both great powers, but more importantly, the small fry, also runs, so to speak. Why? Well, because of our size, resources, and our special responsibilities in world politics. It was an ideological project, as noted by people writing in the post-World War II years. Chapnick's book goes through all of them. My favorite quote is from Blair Fraser, who published a chapter in a collection by Canadian Institute for International Affairs, who said it was a way to keep us apart from the impotent riffraff whose sovereignty is only nominal. I paraphrase, but that was essentially a way of encapsulating the strategy behind it. As a policy guidance, it was ill-conceived. Why? Because successive governments in Ottawa could not possibly meet up the expectations of this special responsibility in world politics. That is the argument Chapnick makes. I think it's a very good one. However, as a national self-conception, it became part and parcel of Canadian national identity, of Canadian foreign policy thinking to this day. So academically, middle powerhood or the construct becomes a thing in the 1970s. So another Canadian, Andrew Cooper, writes that it's essentially influenced by the preoccupations of the relatively small number of scholars who happen to be citizens of middle powers. And so there are many ways to break this literature into constituent parts. I won't go into great detail here. Just in my view, there are 3 schools, but you might differ. You might have 2 or 3 or 4. It doesn't really matter. I'll just say 2 things. So there's no agreed upon definition of what middle power is. So the what question is missing. It's a philosophical question, ontological, if you like, not been answered yet. I don't think it's ever going to be answered. And perhaps more importantly, the debates within this literature has never really influenced the shape of debates within IR theory itself. So it sort of existed in its own cloud without ever informing IR theory. And there are problems, obviously, with the construct we can get into later. However, at the level of policy, at the level of identity, at the level of foreign policy thinking, any other level, it's still alive. The construct is still alive. This is a quote from Chrystia Freeland's 2017 speech in the House of Commons, the foreign policy speech, where she definitely identified Canada as a middle power, dealing with, the turbulent era of world politics. This hasn't changed. In addition to that, you have a whole bunch of authors, some in so-called traditional middle powers, but more importantly, others outside them, talking about the new class of middle powers, emerging, authoritarian, autocratizing, however you want to call it, right? Secondary states whose opinions really matter, whose agency matters in this new era of world politics. And I'll give you an example later. And my own talk kind of builds on a literature that's somewhat adjacent to all of this. It's a literature on rankings, sociological, but also in IR. and specifically power rankings, which I think could be seen as a subset of country performance indicators or global performance indicators. And the first person to write about them in some way in Canada was my colleague at the University of Ottawa, Evan H. Potter, who's in the communications department, his book on branding Canada. All right, so I'll give you some examples. Those who emphasize objectivist, kind of materialist philosophical underpinnings will try to find attributes with which to rank powers. So some of you who are studying IR will be familiar with the composite index of national capability, SINC, which is a part of a larger project called COW, Correlates of War. And it's the mid-20th century, very much Cold War era attempt to find correlates of war, why countries going to war and their decisions to go to war. So it's behavioralist revolution across social sciences affected IR theory as well. And so this one index, SINC, has the following attributes as components of its composite measure of national power: population, urban population, iron steel production, energy consumption, and 2 measures of military capability. These measures in many ways, or rather these economic plus military measures, are still the mainstay of measuring power across fields, not just in political science, you could argue. And so Canada enters this data set in 1920, the year of the League of Nations, right? And guess where it is? It's tucked in between the Czechs and Slovaks on one end and Brazilians on the other, right? Spot number 13. This is the first year, right, in which we have information on Canada in SINC. So at that time, of course, the Ottoman Empire was a thing. They were still in power, still fierce. 100 years later, this is the Ottomans, right? They look like Boris Johnson, former UK prime minister, who himself was part Ottoman, right? So where does Canada rank today on this set of metrics? Well, it's still hovering around top 20, top 25, depending on the year. So evidence that Canada is a middle power on this one very specific set of, on this very specific measurement approach. So you might say, this is hard power, right? Where's soft power? Well, before I get into, I'll just say, Jennifer Lind has this wonderful piece in International Security where she builds on SINC and uses it as a kind of as a point of reference to build an alternative index, right? Looking at ratios, both GDP ratio and the military one. And she says here, according to this inductive method that she calls it of measuring power, most of us, Americans, American academics, but also IR specialists, underestimate the rise of China and its power in the world. So the argument is there's such a thing as global bipolarity. Polarity is one of those chemical metaphors IR theorists like to use, right? So this entire journal, International Security, is essentially devoted to measuring the strategic competition between the United States and China. And that graph over there with the cities is meant to illustrate the point. Chinese cities, if you go by my measure, are as wealthy as most, or if not wealthier, most Western cities. So it's a very good piece that I think indicates a fact. SINC and SINC-like measures are still being used. If you are a graduate student in political science, IR subfield especially, in the United States, you'll be using it as part of your methods training, right? So soft power, where's soft power? Well, already in 1973, people were asking this question. So no sooner than the COW was published and disseminated, IR scholars would say, it's actually not very good because it's missing this component called prestige, now more commonly known as status, right? Where's prestige? And guess who was participating in this? This is a very Canadian project. So this is Bob Cox and Harold Jacobson with some very important future IR theorists, including Joseph Nye, the father of soft power theory, right? But also perhaps more importantly, Susan Strange, the mother of international political economy. So they, together with the said 2 authors, were working on the Social Science Research Council funded study. And they said, well, the world is actually more complicated. We can go with economic and military components, but there's this thing called, prestige, and it really matters. And if we use this composition, and they only use it for 3 years, so it's comparative statics, it's not longitudinal, 1950, all the way to 1967, Canada hovers in top 10, right? It's actually more powerful than perhaps, military and economic metrics would suggest. Why? Well, as Cox often argued, it's partly due to diplomacy, but not just diplomacy, transnational bureaucracy, if you like. Canadians were overrepresented in international organizations, World Bank, IMF, Bretton Woods, all that stuff, or post-Bretton Woods by this time. So that's a really important argument. Now, today, from the perspective of contemporary IR theory, it's sort of commonplace to think about status and prestige, but at that time, it wasn't so obvious. It was actually, in many ways, a path-breaking volume or an intervention. Fast forward to 2025. One of my colleagues at the University of Ottawa, Marie-Ève Desrosiers and Nick Cheeseman, have a book on authoritarian middle powers. And they say, middle power theory is all wrong, right? Not all wrong, but vital, but incomplete, shall we say. Why? Because now, instead of looking at traditional powers that happen to be Western, that happen to be aligned with the so-called liberal international order, you have a whole bunch of middle powers who are anything but. They're interested in authoritarian multilateralism. They like hard power. They also like transactional foreign policy decisions. Now, when you say foreign policy is transactional, it's a pleonasm. Of course it's transactional, but this one is nakedly or explicitly transactional. And they like, disruption. That also is a form of middle power strategizing. It's a short book coming out in the coming weeks or next month, I'm sure. But a very important argument that keeps middle power theory alive, and we'll come back to that perhaps in a bit. So important. Why? Well, because the world is changing, has changed, is about to change even more. The formerly G7 cartel is no more because there's another cartel in town called BRICS Plus, right? So there's a global shift in power from the U.S. so-called West onto the so-called rest, and China in particular. So that's one issue that's going on, the redistribution of state power. But there are others, right? The rise of, what do you want to call it? Nationalist populism. So that was, a project I was involved previously. I prefer the term the radical right. That has tendencies, authoritarian, autocratizing, in countries that were formerly identifiable as liberal democracies, right? So that's another kind of huge change. And third is change more kind of generally speaking, technological, pandemics, migration, and of course, the super wicked problem of climate change. All of these are leading to complex cooperation problem, coordination problem in global governance, and have in very, very strong domestic politics components. So no wonder that middle power theory is changing. So going back to my short conceptual history list, there is a bit of attention being paid to rankings as an idea. So earlier I gave you an example with Cartier, but what I want to do in this paper is rank Canada in a single region using an existing index, right? And so you're wondering, why this region? Well, because our current Indo-Pacific strategy describes this as the global center of economic dynamism and strategic challenge. It's the most important region. So why do we call it Indo-Pacific as opposed to Asia-Pacific? So when I was a student, we would say Asia-Pacific. There's a book by Paul Evans. Today is Indo-Pacific. There are many theories. One is that the key discursive change agent was Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who in 2017 yoked India and the Indian Ocean into a conversation about China and its rise. And it didn't pay off at the beginning, but by 2017 it did. He succeeded because the Trump administration, Trump 1.0, decided to use this new term in its national security strategy. And allies essentially followed from there, including Canada, 2018. China dislikes the term because it sees it as constitutive of reality, which is true, and part of the containment strategy, right? And the other kind of countries in said region have mixed feelings about it. So ASEAN specifically, the ASEAN expert in the room who might correct me if I'm completely off. All right, so yeah, so there are many ways to describe it. But the point is that it's very large. Some countries with Indo-Pacific strategies have very expensive definitions. So France and Britain, yeah, essentially from Africa to the Americas, everything is Indo-Pacific. It really doesn't matter because I'm going by an institutional definition provided by the Lowy Institute. I don't know, some of you might know the Lowy Institute, right? They provide a map of what they call Asia, but it's really Indo-Pacific in the current parlance, with these octagons, I don't know how to call them, right? They're representations of power as measured by the Lowy Institute experts. So there's probably no equivalent to the Lowy Institute, the think tank from Sydney, Australia, in Canada. Think McDonald Laurier, but with a lot more money, and not on the right of politics. The ideological and political picture is harder to determine, but essentially it's an independent bipartisan tank in Sydney, recently established one too. And so in 2018, they had this brilliant idea to come up with a power index for Asia or Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific that will be updated annually, and essentially would allow researchers, but policymakers, citizens, to think about the power shift that I described earlier. And so my question, as soon as I learned about this index, was where's Canada? Why is Canada not in it, right? It should be. I mean, aren't we an Indo-Pacific country? I mean, we have been since the beginning of the 20th century, consciously. Canadian imperialists were writing about the importance of being a Pacific power. Talk about it briefly in this paper. And so if Canada were to be included, where would it fit? I think it's an interesting question that kind of raises some theoretical as well as policy follow-up discussions that I hope we'll get into. So I'll present the rationale behind the index itself, and then my estimates of Canada's place in it. And I should say that this started as a teaching project, not methods, but foreign policy and defense policy classes. I gave it to my undergraduates, I gave it to my graduates, we kind of played with the numbers. But for 2024 version of the index, I decided to do it myself. And this is no shade on my students. Some of the groups did really, really well, others less so. But I thought I should do it myself because the indicators change every year. And of course, world is changing. And my ultimate goal is to compare the 2024 version of the index to the Trump 2.0 version, 2025. And just to see how the region is changing and Canada's place in it. And it's part of a Canadian debate right now, not least in relation to the Indo-Pacific strategy and the various debates about its implementation. So the index defines power as the capacity of a state to direct or influence the environment around it in its favor, right? So not just behavior of other states, but non-state actors and even events. So capacious, ambitious definition, if you like. And they have essentially two ways of doing it, two sets of measures or components, right? First four are resources / material capabilities, if you like, right? The other four is the real innovation. This is where hard power meets soft power, influence, network power, right? Things such as defense networks, diplomatic influence, cultural influence, really creative stuff. So the person behind it is a Belgian scholar, Hervé Lamayou, who came up with a way of thinking about a larger index. And I heard an interview with him, and he says, he was skeptical at first that power can be measured. Second, that it could be put in some kind of an index. I liked him already, right? Skepticism comes from a Greek word to think, right? Obviously you should be skeptical. And so they, for 6 years, they've been updating and producing it, and people are clicking on this website, believe me. I mean, if you go on it, you'll see that it's interactive, it's super interesting, and you can do a lot with it. So hard power and soft power. And if you're some kind of a Marxist, you could say, well, the base plus, superstructure. I mean, I know what this is. Well, yes, Marxist theory is important in influencing, theories of power as we use them today, implicitly or explicitly. So that being said, the motivation is China, right? As it should be. And what they did at Lowy, they thought by tracing the changes in power and influence, they would quickly discover that China is overtaking the United States, right? The bipolar system is becoming less and less bipolar, more and more unipolar, with predictable implications for things such as hegemony, another IR word that we use often when we think about regional power and influence, right? So that's one motivation for sure. But what they discovered is the US has a lot of enduring power or staying power. Over the life of the index, the US has had 10 points over China fairly consistently, right? It's a big finding, kind of in some ways counterintuitive, given what we hear in the news, what we hear in the academic journals, some academic journals. I've always been a China rise skeptic. Last time I gave a talk at Queen's, I called it "What Post-American World?" Boy, was I wrong, right? But that is where we are. Those are some kinds of debates that we constantly have, and it was in relation to hegemonic stability theory and hegemonic transition theory. We might get into it in the Q&A. So, U.S. has the lead on all these components except two: economic relationships and diplomatic influence. So you might ask, well, how do they measure these things? This doesn't make sense. This is just some figures that are fancy, but what's behind it? So these components are weighted. If you go on their website, the website is interactive. You can reweight them. If you're a realist, you say only military power matters. I'm going to crank up that lever. 100% is military capability. The rest doesn't matter. Very useful for teaching, certainly, but also for thinking about power more generally. Okay, but they have their own in-house weighting. By the way, they brought one of the 4 large accounting firms to check their data. I mean, they have a budget, right? 10 million Australian dollars a year. So I think it was PricewaterhouseCoopers who sent, a team of accountants to check some of these numbers. Really interesting. And they went through a peer review that included academics. So it's no different from IR theorists think they do when they talk about power. So I'll show you what they did with economic relationships and defense networks. So these are measures, and these measures have submeasures, indicators, right? 130 plus of them. They keep adding them every year. That raises questions about comparability over time, but it's really interesting. During COVID, they wondered, okay, does your country produce vaccines? Is it able to administer, COVID vaccine? What percentage of population? So they kept adding indicators as, for a metric of state capacity, which is, I think, entirely valid. So that's what they are. Generally, about 50% of them are in-house, 50% are kind of, open source. And using them, the claim is that, you can actually analyze power. I think that's perhaps one step too far. Most people who study IR, who write and read books such as Power and World Politics, who say, no, you can't. It's nice PR exercise, but you're not doing relational, situational, dynamic analysis of power. You need context, right? And essentially for that, you need a story to be told in a single article, chapter, book, whatever. It's not, an index is just an index, right? It's not an analysis of power. It's not power of analysis. So, getting scores is great, but what do we do with that? That said, it's a start. It's a start of a conversation. It's a brush clearing exercise. It's useful for policy. It's useful for teaching. It's useful, I think, for theory too. Now, one of the issues is that data or data analysis is not always clear or available. So the 50% of the in-house indicators that they use are not often transparent, right? Sometimes the indicators they use are, in fact, proprietary. They belong to the Financial Times, and to use the Financial Times indicator, you have to pay subscription, right? So I didn't have access to think tank level funding there's no funding. No one funded this study. It was just me working on it this summer. So yeah, there are problems with measuring power, but as this, mid-20th century historian of the balance of power said, we must do it regardless of the primitive character of the scales at their disposal. I think that's true. Yeah, as I said earlier, it's a starting point, if anything. So that's the comprehensive power, right? And my question is, where might Canada be on this list in the year 2024? Now, before we go into Canada, I just want to say this is hugely important for some countries. In India, it's really big news. So it's a cultural event, the publication of the annual update of the index. Everyone comments on it. Everyone meaning academics and essentially the chattering class, but also in some cases government, right? Because they're being forced at various press conferences to say, why is India not a major power? Why is India not closer to China? Why is India below Japan? China reacts negatively. Similar with the Indo-Pacific, rankings have constitutive effects as well. This is part of the containment strategy. Your goal is to make us look bad. So imagine Global Times, the mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party, written in English, my favorite tabloid published in Beijing. They usually have an op-ed that criticize any kind of anything related to the Asia Power Index. So it matters, even if it's wrong methodologically. That's the thing with indices. Their quality in terms of science or social science is secondary to their effects in terms of consequences for politics, society, and culture. So where's Canada? Well, we have an N of 15 plus from Japan and India anchoring one end of the continuum to Brunei and North Korea anchoring the other end. Where do you think Canada fits? What would be your best guess? Who wants to try? Paper's so new, I never shared it with anyone. So you have no idea what I'm saying. But it is based on research in which I attempted to replicate and reverse engineer the Lowy Institute methodology. All right, it's 10th, stuck between Indonesia and Thailand. So how do I get this number, right? It's not bad, not great, not bad, not great, depending on your priors, right? Depending on what you think about Canadian middle powerhood in the Indo-Pacific. So these are estimates. Some are quantitative, some are qualitative, some are more technical than others. Some are essentially guesstimates. I didn't have access to, Baidu online search data, only Google Trends. So some indicators are sort of, 50% confidence that I got it right. Private commercial platforms like FDI markets didn't have money to pay for it, so I couldn't use it in this exercise. It's really a thought exercise. But, some of them I have confidence I got right. And so these are the numbers. This is the final tally. This is where, Canada fits in the 2024 version of the index. So I'll go through all of the indicators just to give you a sense of, relative strengths and weaknesses of Canada according to the API, Asia Power Index. So in terms of GDP, they use GDP adjusted for purchasing power parity in constant dollars. That's only 40% of this measure. So yes, Canada has a huge economy, but that's not its strength. It's technological sophistication. So one of the indicators, Nobel Prize, awarded to Canadian citizens, right? You can say, well, are they really Canadian citizens if they're in the United States? No, I mean, that's essentially one indicator that goes into one measure. Renewable energy is important. Size is important, but less important. And connectivity, right? Canada ranks 8th in connectivity. Why? Merchant fleet in Canada is smaller than Russia's, things of that sort. And then leverage, corporate giants. I'll talk about corporate giants in a bit. We have them. They're just not as gigantic as those located in the peer countries. So 8th overall is not bad. Essentially Australia, right? Okay, what about military capability? Sorry, we are the New Zealand of the North. As much as I respect the Royal Canadian Navy, as do my daughters, it simply does not have the capability to project force in the region. And there are good reasons, right? We are a 3-ocean country, 3 regions, on the periphery, if you like, of the Indo-Pacific. But the other reason is really defense spending. right? That is probably one of the weaknesses, the most blatant weaknesses on this particular index of power. So I'm happy to go into it in the Q&A, but they have some really interesting indicators such as signature capabilities, Asian, military posture, things of that sort. And this one is pretty, I'm pretty sure I got this one right because it's very quantitative. You can just count things and add them up. Resilience. So this is interesting, right? Earlier Cold War era indices would never talk about something like resilience. Or they would talk about it only implicitly. So having nukes, nuclear weapons, is an indicator of resilience. North Korea, not powerful on most metrics, but has nuclear weapons. It gives us, it's an indicator of having latent power, right? That could become and does become influence. So Canada's strengths are energy trade, government effectiveness, right? Compared to some countries in the Indo-Pacific, very stable. Climate change too, right? Better than Australia in some ways. And borders. Only 6 border disputes compared to China's 10. China has 27 neighbors, not all of which are happy about China, right? And 10 border disputes. That's a large number. And we are resolving ours, most recently with Denmark. So weaknesses, fuel trade balance, fuel security, rare earth metals mining. Why aren't we mining rare earth metals? I mean, those are the kinds of obvious things, but nothing is as obvious as US dependence. And that keeps coming up because some indicators in this index tend to overlap with each other. That's perhaps a weakness, yeah? So that's resilience. 7th, Australia. Future resources. I got this from Danielle Smith's campaign in Alberta. Economic projections, defense projections, broad resources projections, and demography. Those are the future resources. They have indicators, each one of them. They're weighted differently. So as it turns out, economic projections based on the 2024 iteration of the index were much stronger than defense ones. Defense capability takes generations to build and less than a generation to lose, right? And so they are stronger than defense, which is an interesting thing to think about. Broad resources, how's your economy doing, politics, in year 2035, solid, right? On demography, it's also solid, but we're not, there's no maximum Canada happening by the end of the century. Your professor here, Christian Leuprecht, wrote on demography, 10 years ago. I think it was in Canadian Foreign Policy Journal. And so the year is 2050 here, right? Canada is supposed to have, 46, while Thailand will have, will go down to whatever, 60, 68. So that explains in part why Canada is 11th. You would imagine it'd be higher, but it's not. All right, now we're moving to soft power. I'm using this with quotation marks. Soft power set of indicators or measures with their indicators. So economic relationships. Yeah, so Canada is a trading nation, much like Japan, much like Germany, whatever. But globally, regionally, we're working on things. The Ottawa dialogue, the Ottawa process, those are important policy initiatives. But there are many others that are happening in the region to which we're not part of. Once again, your professor, Stephanie Martel, might correct me if I'm wrong, but there's potential for growth, right? And that's reflected in the picture of economic relationships. Again, this is our main partner in the region, not just this region, but for the purposes of the index in this region. And that is a weakness, right? In terms of foreign direct investment flows, but also buying and selling power and lack of diversity. We'll come back to that very last point in the very last point of the talk. So defense networks, strong, but also potentially weak for the same reasons. Kenneth Waltz, one of the fathers of structural realist IR theory, said countries survive in 2 ways: internal balancing or external balancing, right? We're good with alliances, but alone as a sovereign, whatever, strategically autonomous player, not so much. Not the only one. The US has 5 formal allies, not counting New Zealand. Condoleezza Rice once described New Zealand as a friend, but not an ally. all of them depend on the US security umbrella. But what's happening, beyond Trump 2.0, right? That's the big question mark. But the way they measure it is essentially the depth of alliances, how many times you participated in US-led military interventions, for how long, are you going to military exercises like the biannual RIMPAC, and et cetera, et cetera. It's also a very sophisticated way of looking at things such as defense diplomacy. It's really, if you ask someone at D&D, at their defense diplomacy desk, what are we doing in the Indo-Pacific? They don't know. But actually, this index can help you answer that question because it has a way of tracing all of these activities systematically. Diplomatic influence, right? The estimate is 12th spot, essentially same as Thailand. We have a very solid diplomatic network, right? What the index calls multilateral power is very good. It's also part of Canadian national identity and foreign policy thinking, multilateralism. Solid on effectiveness and autonomy, right? And even in the UN, you could say, well, we are increasingly doing a very good job, right? Because we tend to agree with most of the countries in the world as opposed to with some of the countries in the world. So I'll give you a graph. This is from a different study I did with a student/friend. Where's Canada on this representation of voting clusters in the United Nations General Assembly? Well, as a big picture, there's the rest. China is on the periphery of the rest. There's the West, it's the bottom. So this is the kind of 40 countries that belong to this Western alliance. And there's this US cluster, which is US, Israel, various islands in the Pacific. And Canada is, hovering in between the US cluster and the Western cluster. It does not, that kind of tells you a little bit about this idea of like-minded states, who are Canada's like-minded partners. Well, it really depends on this one measure. It doesn't seem like we have as many like-minded partners as we like to think we do. That pushes our score downward. Now, cultural influence. This is perhaps the most innovative, interesting part of the Asia Power Index. My estimate is that Canada is 7th between Malaysia and Thailand. What are the strengths? Well, we get a lot of students, not students globally, but students from the region, from Indo-Pacific, which is great. The so-called cultural distance that this country has had with Asia has narrowed since the end of the Cold War, especially since the 2000s. And it keeps narrowing, right? Immigrants coming from the region into Canada, right? Despite the recent changes to immigration policy, still strong numbers and are projected to remain strong on this particular dimension. Global brands, solid, right? There are Canadian global brands that are very, very popular in Asia. Tim Hortons, right? If you go to South Korea, it is the place you want to hang out and study, even though it's not really Canadian anymore, but then, you get my point. And prestige sites. Canada has prestige sites. You could say 20 is a large number, but maybe not as large as it should be. China has 50 or more. Australia has 20 as well. What are the weaknesses? Well, we're not really well connected to the region. Yes, you can fly direct to various capitals of Asia and other places, but we're not Singapore or anything like that. We are on the periphery geographically. Cultural exchange could be a lot better. Diaspora influence, not diaspora from Asia in Canada. Canadian citizens in Asia, there are a large number of those, are not really organized as a diaspora for various reasons. And the news media influence, CBC syndicates a lot of shows around the world, but they're just not in Asia, or Asia doesn't care about them. Same with, Canadian newspapers. And yes, you could say that global brands, what are top global brands? They're banks. You wanna build a brand perhaps the way South Korea did, which was a state project, right, in the mid 1990s. Someone brought a memo to the Ministry of Finance, said, look, the Jurassic Park, the movie, made 200 times more money than all of the Hyundais we sold in the world. And PMO, or the Korean equivalent, said, actually, let's do something about this. Let's create a cultural incubator for K-pop, K-beauty, K-drama, K-everything. That was in mid-1990s. talk about state capitalism, right? It worked really well because Korea is high on cultural influence. This is the secondary analysis. So what the index does is perhaps super interesting, especially for, Indian watchers of the index. Where, who are the overachievers, who are the underachievers? So they have a trend line. It's, little basic linear regression that reveals how each country does in terms of expected influence given its resources. Now, this is not a data set the way it's used in social science where, click and download a code book and then you download the data and then you use it on your own, with other variables in your hard drive. You kind of have to reverse engineer it because, it's a think tank, right? It's 2/3 social science, right? Not fully social science. And so I tried, I think I got it right. And it surprised me. Canada's power gap is not huge. Yes, it's negative, but it's leading the pack of underachievers, and not by much, within the margin of error, right? We're essentially, exactly where New Zealand is, on the line. So we're not overachieving, not underachieving, essentially what you'd expect. And, it's a simple, hopefully not simple-minded measure, but it's there. It could inform some policy discussion. So what are policy discussions? Sorry if I'm running a little long. So I think rankings are here to stay. Check out this one. It's from Visual Capitalist, which is a website that produces really cool graphs. I mean, at what point did we start discussing, Canadian membership in the EU? This is like 2 months ago. And now their rankings, where would Canada rank in the EU? So this idea of ranking, Christopher Browning has a book. There are a lot of really interesting works. Ann Towns and Paul Beaumont, their work is really superb on what rankings do, not what, how they're put up together methodologically. That's a less interesting question, but what they do, and they do a lot. And power rankings are kind of joining the fray, if you like. So this is a pilot study. I think more years are needed in order for any kind of meaningful story about Canadian middle powerhood to be told. I think it's, if I were an ambitious person, I'd say, well, what I'm really interested in is coming up with some kind of a historical story of Canada, how Canada ranked vis-a-vis its peers from Confederation to Trump. And how, what used to be ranking forms practiced in the humanities, how many times Canada shows up in the imagination of Virginia Woolf or, a Victorian novel. How those kinds of ranking indicators give way to social scientific fetishization of numbers, which is essentially, last 50 years. And it's super interesting to look at, I think. It's a story of Canada and the world, or Canada in/and the world. But, this is a mere pilot study that deals with just one indicator, index in just 1 year. So for middle power theory, does this burst any illusions about Canada's place in the world and the region specifically? I don't know. I guess you can tell me that. What I really want to do in the conclusion is compare some of the analysis of the strengths and weaknesses from this paper to the analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the implementation of the Indo-Pacific Strategy. So the House of Commons has an interim report published in 2024 that compares the two. So that's something I'll engage in. And in terms of policy, so what are the key weaknesses? I mentioned defense earlier, but I really spend the most time discussing economic relationships, diversification. So the last time we had a big national level debate about strategy, questions of national interest in strategy, this was 1971, time of the Nixon shocks. And the government speak at the time, this was, Trudeau, the father, we had 3 options. The first 2 options were essentially integrate with the United States. Status quo, integrate more continentally, or build a nation, so essentially what Carney is proposing, and find partners in Japan and Europe, but elsewhere. And so I read the memoirs of the minister who was in charge of the memo, that included the word third option. I like it a lot, but turns out that there's not much discussion of it in the memoir. So one has to go into the Library and Archives Canada to learn what exactly the third option was. But the idea generally was a very good one, right? Diversify ties away from the United States. That's the only way to reduce vulnerability, right? I mean, it is the Canadian kind of question in terms of politics and policy, but I think it was discussed much more seriously in the 70s than ever since then. So I'll stop there. Sorry if I ran longer than normal, but now it's time for Q&A, and I thank you for your time. And by the way, the paper is available. Just send me an email, and we'll discuss it over, in various other ways. Cheers. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, questions?
Hi, I'm Colonel Negozzi. I'm one of the visiting defense fellow here.
Yes.
Do you think the respectability of an index can be kind of reverse engineered as a policy tool to say, okay, where do we rank lower, and can we focus on those areas as a way to reliably increase national influence?
Yeah, great question. Do I collect them, or how does it work? What's the norm?
Yep.
One by one?
Yep.
Okay. Yes. Oh, sorry.
No, okay.
Sorry, apologies. So wonderful question. I asked people who worked in PMO, do you have an index that you use when you talk about power and influence? The answer is no. But countries like Norway, they do, not an index, but they have a 2x2. What's our national interest? What is the likelihood of our impact? High, low, high, low. And then, you put priority in various boxes. So this kind of index-like thinking takes place in the kitchens of power or government power all the time. I think this is a useful exercise, thought exercise for governments, as it is for academics who are engaged in teaching and researching power and influence in world politics, because it's a conversation starter, right? If you think it's wrong, why is it wrong? How would you do it differently? I mean, this is a pretty impressive exercise, 130 plus indicators that they keep perfecting over time. It's by definition useful. Whether it's correct, it's more correct than having nothing. and it's imperative to improve it in using different theories. In this building, there are different departments. Each department has favorite theory of power. Well, that's part of the conversation as well. So yeah, that's what I would say to that. But some countries take it very seriously. India, for sure, its government uses this to think about India's ability to project power, let's say, in the Malacca Strait.
Next.
Hi, Srdjan. I'm really happy that you're doing this, and I really like how you're especially well positioned to talk about this stuff, because you have embedded in your, let's figure out where Canada stands is a critique of, what our rankings really doing,
Right.
which I really like. I have a specific question, and then I had also the privilege of reading the draft article. So, I have a ton of questions for you.
Super.
But then I'm going to focus on this just one for now. So it seems to me that, the exercise clearly is interesting, but we're kind of comparing apples and oranges, of course, for a number of reasons. But I was thinking especially around the level of embeddedness of those states in the region, right? It's not a coincidence that Canada is somewhere between Thailand and Indonesia. When you think about the way that those countries clearly can be seen as middle powers in the Indo-Pacific, where Canada has a claim to be a middle power in general.
Globally.
Right? So there's no claim about Thailand being a middle power outside of its own neighborhood.
Right.
So then I'm wondering how you deal with this in the article, if at all, or how you would plan to deal with this. Is it just, is it a footnote? Is it a 1-2 sentences to kind of situate the context, or is there like something broader that needs to be addressed here?
Great question. Thank you. So I deal with it poorly because the article is yet to be fully fleshed out. But my response would be this: I'm okay with apples to oranges. I try to avoid, apple orchards versus orange groves, right? That means I'm really, really wrong. But here, apples to oranges, it's true. Canada is a 3-region country, or a regional power without a region, right? That's the kind of old saw about, Canadian positioning, role, place, and position in the international system. So we will forever be, beyond top 10. And that number will simply, will keep dropping, I think, given, future resources, trends, and other things. And I think that's the value, because it punctures certain remaining illusions about Canada's place in the world. So this has a public education function. I'm not saying my paper does, but indices such as this one have a public education function. I mean, there are good reasons why this is an Australian index rather than an Indian or a Chinese or an American. They would look completely different. And they would be, I think, less objective, and I'm using positivist language with caution, right? They would be less subjective. So yes, it's a problem, but we get to talk about the problem. Thank you.
Okay, I have one question from someone online who's following, Sanajita Amin. Said, thank you for the talk. I learned a lot. I have one quick question. How does Canada's activism in international organizations influence its recognition and ranking as a middle power?
That's a really good question. So that would be part of the influence measure of diplomacy. And activism, they have ways of looking at it, but it's right now I can only talk at the kind of aggregate level. And so our activism, you could argue, was historically very high because the West was predominant on most reasonable measures of power of, and activism in the United Nations system. If Amin means, our bids for a seat on the United Nations Security Council, I think that's just an index of our changing world. Other countries are simply not going to support our bid because we're not as important as we used to be. And we're seen as, unfortunately, as an extension of a single part of the West rather than a country that has to contribute beyond. And that will take a generation to change as well. It's a short answer to a much more complex question. I hope it's a good start of a conversation. Thank you.
Next.
Hi, Officer Cadet Goodyear at RMC. I wanted to ask about the military capabilities. How does the fact that Canada is so far away from Asia and that mobilizing any sort of military assets and reaching that region would be a lot more difficult than if, say, New Zealand were to mobilize assets for some arising conflict?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Officer Goodyear. I think it really shows when you look, measure geographic distance. Auckland is closer to the center of the region than Victoria Island is, right? Even though New Zealand is its own continent. I mean, I think geographers in the room would say it's not, part of Asia. It's its own continent, right? Just an island on top of it. But the other part of your question, I think, is more important. We just don't have the troops on the Pacific side of the country. I mean, what's the closest military base as opposed to naval base? It's not in BC. You have to go to Alberta, Wainwright, or something like that, to get to the 3rd Division, which is, where the troops are. They're stationed there in case of a contingency, right? So I think as a country, historically, we've always looked to Europe. And the trends are being reinforced by the kinetic war in Europe. So if that changes, I'm talking about kinetic war, then we might discover that, in fact, we're also a Pacific power. But that would require huge sacrifices on the part of everyone, and not just the military, but literally everyone in Canada.
So for a couple of decades, Canada's clearly been an underachiever.
Mhm.
Will Carney be able to change that?
So I should say, and I love this question. I love political questions. It's certainly an ambitious government. I think the fear with ambitious agendas is that people can get disappointed very fast. So from going with the elbows up discourse to the heads in the sand practice could be a short distance. And I'm worried. I think the government's taking a little too long to get off the ground in terms of organizing just bureaucratic and institutional capacity to bring these changes into effect or promise changes into effect. But generally, as an agenda, increasing state capacity, I think that's great. That goes to the core of what, previous ministers in a government like this one were saying. We need to act like a nation, as opposed to what did Cartier say, in 1867, a mere provincial colony. And I think that's a multi-generational project, not something that could be done by any single government. But Trump 2.0 is, making us act in ways that even a year ago would have been unthinkable. So it's still early to say, would be my answer.
Another online question from Abhishek Chaudhary asking, is there any scope for India and Canada to cooperate in Indo-Pacific?
I hope so. I spent a good part of my career, such as it is, in Ottawa, trying to effectuate something of a closer relationship between Canada and India. I even took my family to a sabbatical in New Delhi in the winter. If you know anything about winters in New Delhi, you can imagine how the family reacted to this. So I think there is scope. Prime Minister Modi coming to the G7 meeting was a first step. I think it's very difficult for Canada and Canadians to understand that, in geopolitics, you have to sacrifice all kinds of principles. I'm talking about, the unhappy events that happened in the relationship between two our countries, none of which were our fault. I know most of my Indian colleagues would disagree. But the geopolitical changes, I think, are necessitating Canadian governments to act with not just prudence, but a degree of pragmatism and realism. And I think the current government certainly is making those promises and might be moving in that direction. I think the time of, so Dean Acheson, I'll quote Dean Acheson, again, Cold War era. So he described Canada once as the stern voice of the daughter of God. And I think those are those days are over. I think if we are to survive as a country in this increasingly violent system, we will have to we'll have to move into pragmatic foreign policy decision making and activism. Thank you.
And I believe that's our time. If you join me in thanking our speaker today.
Thank you.